She was a military nurse in 1944. He was a prisoner, quiet, foreign, forgotten. They weren't supposed to speak. They weren't supposed to notice each other. And they certainly weren't supposed to feel anything at all. But sometimes, the heart doesn't follow the rules. And sometimes, the most meaningful connection of your life is the one you never speak out loud. This isn't a story about rebellion. It's a story about stillness, about presence, about love that lived entirely in what was never said. You don't think it's going to happen to you. You wear the uniform, follow the orders, show up where you're told. You keep your head down, hands clean, voice measured. You do your job. That's what I told myself, especially there at the camp. It was quiet work compared to what I'd seen before. Nothing like the base hospitals overseas or the field clinics that always smelled like metal and hurt. At the camp, the men were tired. Some angry, some numb. But all of them were human, whether the world wanted to remember that or not. And I was just a nurse, doing my rounds, keeping it professional, staying within the lines. Until the day I noticed him. Not because he stood out. He didn't. He wore the same plain uniform as the rest, ate the same meals, walked the same dusty paths behind the wire fence like all the others. But there was something about the way he moved, calm, sure, quiet without being afraid. He didn't lower his eyes when we passed. That was the first thing. Most of the men behind the fence avoided eye contact. Out of shame, maybe. Or habit. Or training. But he didn't. He met my gaze. Not bold. Not cold. Just steady. Like he wasn't seeing a uniform. Like he was seeing me. And it's strange, the way one moment like that can lodge itself into you like a thorn you don't know is there, until it starts to ache when you least expect it. I told myself I was imagining it. That it meant nothing. That maybe he looked at everyone that way. But the next week, he showed up in the infirmary with a sprained wrist. A routine injury. Lifting crates, they said. He barely spoke, and when he did, his voice was calm and low, the kind that holds more than it says. I treated the wrist, wrote the chart, moved on. But when he turned to leave, I felt it again, that pause. That moment between nothing and something. That stillness. And that night, while washing up, I realized I was replaying it. Not the treatment. Not the words. Just the stillness. Days passed. He returned. Another injury. Minor again. But enough to bring him back into that sterile, white room. Enough to cross paths again. I started noticing small things. How he carried himself. How he listened more than he spoke. How, even in silence, he seemed present. There was no flirtation. No gestures. Just a kind of mutual recognition, quiet, unspoken, unexpected. And I noticed myself too. How I lingered at the window a few seconds longer. How I checked the infirmary log twice instead of once. How I found comfort in the way he occupied space, undemanding, but undeniably alive. It wasn't a crush. I'd had those before, when I was young enough to believe in grand gestures and first dances. This was different. This was slower. Quieter. Like something growing in the dark that didn't need permission to bloom. I never told anyone. How could I? A nurse. A man behind the wire. That was all anyone would see. They wouldn't care that he was kind. That he listened. That he remembered my name, even though he had no reason to. That he once brought me a folded scrap of paper, a pencil drawing of a bird in flight. He said nothing when he handed it to me. And I said nothing when I pinned it above my sink at home, where no one else would see. Every morning, I'd glance at it before heading out. And every morning, I'd ask myself what it meant to care about someone you were never supposed to know. There were rules. Spoken. Unspoken. Etched into the lines between our uniforms. But caring isn't something you're ordered to do. It slips in through the smallest cracks, through a glance, a gesture, a shared silence that stretches just a second longer than it should. And once it's there, it doesn't ask for permission. It just stays. There were moments I looked forward to. Small ones. Insignificant on the surface. A shift change that aligned with outdoor work duty. A misplaced folder that needed returning near the fence line. A broken water valve that required temporary rerouting past the old mess hall. Any excuse, really, to be near the place where he might be. It wasn't love. Not yet. Not then. But it was the beginning of something I hadn't felt in years. An alertness, a stirring, the way a room feels just before someone you've missed walks through the door. That quiet anticipation. It became part of my day. Part of me. We never touched. Not even by accident. But somehow, the absence of touch made every glance more real. Like we were building something delicate out of nothing but awareness. A bridge made of eye contact and breath and patience. He would nod sometimes. Or lift one shoulder in a silent, hello. Once, I caught him looking at the drawing I'd pinned to the wall behind me. The bird he had given me. He said nothing, but I saw it in his face, he remembered. I never took it down. People talk about longing like it's loud. But it isn't. Not always. Sometimes longing is the quietest feeling in the world. It hums in the background while you fold linens or fill syringes. It waits on the edge of your day, showing up in the way your hand pauses just a second longer on the doorknob. That's how it was with him. Not loud, but constant. I began to notice things I hadn't before. How the guards spoke more sharply when I lingered. How eyes followed me when I walked toward the medical storage near the outer gates. How even the nurses started asking quiet questions behind their coffee cups. I pretended not to hear. But the walls were there. Always. Not just the chain link and barbed wire, but the invisible ones, heavier still. He was on one side. And I, on the other. I told myself it was nothing. That I was simply being kind. Professional. That I was imagining connections that weren't truly there. But I knew better. It wasn't fantasy. It wasn't foolishness. It was something real. But real doesn't always mean allowed. One evening, after everyone had gone, I stayed late to finish paperwork. The infirmary was quiet, the only sound the tick of the clock above the sink. I found myself tracing my finger along the edge of the desk. Thinking about him. Thinking about what it meant to feel more seen in passing than I had in entire conversations with others. Thinking about how someone behind a fence could still make me feel free. That night, I dreamed of open skies. Of birds not flying away, but circling back. And when I woke, I felt the ache of something I could not name. The drawing stayed above my sink for months. Faded, soft at the edges. But more alive than anything else in that room. And I kept glancing at it. Day after day. Waiting for a sign. Hoping for a moment that might say, "You're not the only one." But some things don't speak with words. Some things just wait for you to be brave. There's a moment, always, when the silence starts to feel heavier than the words you've avoided. It had been months. The drawing above my sink was beginning to curl at the edges. The weather had shifted. The windows fogged in the mornings. And the camp seemed colder, not just in temperature, but in mood. People had begun to notice. I could feel it in the way conversations changed when I entered the room. In the way some of the nurses looked at me too quickly, or not at all. In the way the guards near the infirmary started asking questions with their eyes, not their mouths. I hadn't done anything. But sometimes, it's not what you do, it's what you feel. And people can sense that, even when they don't understand it. I started keeping my distance. Not just from him, but from everything that felt vulnerable. I took the longer route to work. I left the infirmary as soon as my shift ended. I stopped looking toward the fences. Stopped folding the towels the way I knew he preferred. But distance doesn't erase connection. It only hides it behind more walls. And no matter how many I built, he was still there. In the quiet. In the stillness. In the ache of something unfinished. One afternoon, I saw him standing near the far edge of the yard, alone. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. But he looked at me, just once, long enough for me to know that he knew. That I was pulling away. That something had changed. And the guilt of that look stayed with me all night. I tried to distract myself. Took on extra shifts. Volunteered to inventory supplies. Organized cabinets that didn't need organizing. But in every drawer, every list, every folded sheet, he was there, not in form, but in memory. And memory is the most persistent visitor of all. Then came the moment I couldn't ignore. He was brought into the infirmary by 2 guards. A fall, they said. Slipped during kitchen duty. Nothing serious, but protocol required medical review. I moved quickly, professionally. Hands steady. Eyes low. But when I touched his arm to examine the bruise, I felt it, the same calm steadiness that had pulled me in from the start. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. But his presence flooded the room. And for the first time in weeks, I wanted to speak. To say something, anything. To let the wall crumble. But the guards were close. The nurses were watching. And I wasn't brave enough. Not yet. That night, I walked home in the dark. The cold bit at my face, and every step felt heavier than the last. I passed the diner where I used to stop for tea. Past the bench where I once sat and watched the sun come up after a night shift. And I thought about him. Not the uniform. Not the fence. But the way his silence had always made space for mine. I realized something then. That I had spent so much time fearing what others might say. I hadn't asked myself what I needed to say. To him. To myself. To the part of me that had stopped believing in softness, until I saw it in his eyes. That weekend, I wrote him a letter. I didn't sign it. I didn't use names. Just words, simple, unpolished, true. I folded it once. Then again. And again. Then I set it on fire in the kitchen sink. Some things are meant to be felt. Not delivered. But even as the ashes floated into the drain, I knew it. I loved him. Not with certainty. Not with clarity. But with the quiet, steady weight of truth. And no amount of silence could change that. The day everything changed didn't start differently. There was no sign, no shift in the sky, no whisper in the wind. It began like any other, quiet, gray, ordinary. But sometimes, the most important things happen in the plainest hours. Not because the world allows them, but because the heart stops waiting for permission. I was cleaning a drawer in the infirmary when I saw his name on the list. Transfer. 3 days. Destination. Undisclosed. There was no warning. No explanation. Just an order typed in black ink, sitting on my desk like a stone. I stared at it for a long time. The drawer remained open. There are moments when time folds. When all the months of glances and silence and unsent words collapse into a single breath. And in that breath, you know, this is your only chance. I waited until late evening. The halls were empty. The guards were lighter on rotation. I walked the long path toward the outer storage building, a route I hadn't taken in weeks. My heart felt like it was holding its breath. And there he was, stacking crates. Alone. He saw me before I spoke. And in his eyes, no surprise. Just the stillness I remembered. I didn't plan what I was going to say. Because there was nothing left to explain. He was leaving. And I hadn't told him what I needed to. I stepped closer than I ever had before. Close enough to see the wear on his collar. Close enough to smell soap and dust and something faintly metallic. And for the first time, I let myself speak honestly. Not loudly. Not bravely. Just, honestly. I didn't know how much I needed to feel seen until you saw me. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His face softened. His shoulders fell. And I knew he had felt it too. All along. I didn't touch him. Even then. Not because I didn't want to. But because I needed that memory to live outside of risk. I needed it to remain untarnished. Something that belonged only to us and the silence we had guarded for so long. He nodded once. And I turned away before I could cry. I didn't look back. Some goodbyes are too sacred for second glances. He left on a rainy morning. I watched the truck from the 3rd floor. No one saw me. And when it disappeared down the gravel road, I pressed my hand to the window. Ink-stained and trembling. Not in sorrow. Not in regret. But in quiet acknowledgement. That I had chosen something real. Even if it never got to stay. Weeks passed. Then months. The camp changed. Faces came and went. Rules shifted. Names were forgotten. But I remembered. Not the details. Not the logistics. Just him. The way he made the world quieter. The way silence had never felt so full. I left the drawing above my sink for years. Eventually, the paper yellowed. The corners curled. But I never took it down. And even now, decades later, when I wipe the steam from my mirror each morning and stare at the woman I've become, I sometimes see him beside me. Not as a ghost. Not as regret. but as a moment I chose. Freely. Softly. Without permission. There are kinds of love that don't fit into the stories people like to tell. Love that happens without touch. Without names. Without a proper beginning or a clean ending. And maybe that's what makes it real. It didn't ask to be written. But it left ink on my hands anyway. There are stories we carry not in our minds, but in our bodies. In the way we pause at a window. In the way we run our fingers across old photographs. In the way we remember someone, not by what they said, but by how they made the silence feel. This was one of those stories. A story without fireworks. Without declarations. Without a proper ending. And maybe that's exactly why it matters. Because not all love is loud. Not all choices are public. And not all moments of truth come with applause. Some arrive in stillness. In the glance of a man behind a fence. In the drawing of a bird left wordlessly. In the simple act of being seen when no one else was looking. This story isn't about rule breakers. It's not even about rebellion. It's about a feeling so gentle, so human, it couldn't be named out loud. So it lived quietly in glances, in spaces, in things left unsaid. And maybe you felt something like it too. Maybe there's someone you didn't choose, but you remember them anyway. Or maybe there's a part of your heart that still carries a silence like this. Something soft. Something unfinished. Something that never asked for permission to exist, but did anyway. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of someone, or helped you feel less alone in something you've never spoken, tell us in the comments. Have you ever cared for someone you weren't supposed to? Have you ever let go not because you didn't love, but because you loved quietly and that had to be enough? These are the stories we tell here. Stories that don't always make the front page. Stories that whisper instead of shout. But still, they matter. Because you matter. If you felt something today, consider subscribing. Not just for more stories, but because maybe, just maybe, one day, someone will hear their story in yours. Thank you for listening. And for remembering with us.